Good morning, everybody. It's good to see all of you here. Glad that you've made it out on a kind of rainy, nasty day. So kudos to you on that. Want to welcome you to joining us. Glad you're with us. I'm Andy. If we've not met, I'd love to get to know you. We can meet out in the lobby afterwards. Would love to just catch up a little bit, get to know you just a little bit. And welcome also those watching online. Glad you're joining us today as well, now or later. I don't know if you've ever done this. Sometimes I wonder, what would it be like to have been there when Jesus was walking the earth? You know, we can read the words he said, but to hear him teach would be so much different. You could see his tone of hear his tone of voice and see his body language and his face. Like, what would that have been like? What was his voice like? What was his eyes like when he was talking to somebody who was broken? You know, how often did he get angry or laugh or cry? I just feel like there must have been some really big advantages for those who were there to understand God through Jesus because they saw it firsthand. Because Scripture says he wasn't just a guy, he wasn't just a man as extraordinary as he was God in the flesh. Colossians chapter 1 says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all of creation. For in Jesus all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus was God in the flesh. If you want to know what God is like, study the life of Jesus, because he was God among us. The Bible says this verse says he holds all things together. John has similar language when he's describing Jesus in the first chapters of his gospel. John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. You see that same kind of language, how Jesus was here all along creating everything that we see. He says, in the beginning was the Word. He's referring to Jesus there. And that phrase, the Word, literally means, it's translated from the Greek word logos, it literally means the sum total of all knowledge. It's like the DNA of the universe. Jesus is the sum total of all the knowledge in the universe, and he created everything from that knowledge. He's the centerpiece of creation. He was with God in creation, and through him, everything was made because he was the sum total of all the design. Nothing was made without him. Nothing happens without him. John continues a few verses later and says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John's describing Jesus as the light of all mankind. Jesus' very life illuminates the world. He later concludes in verse 14 saying, that same word, Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. God took on flesh in Jesus. God made his dwelling among us in Jesus. And that means he took on all the limitations that we deal with. It says temptations and things. I don't even just mean that. I mean like physical weaknesses, like aches and pains. Jesus had them. He's a carpenter. Like fatigue or sickness. Jesus got a cold. He got the flu. All of that stuff was something Jesus dealt with. Jesus took on all of what flesh entails. And yet, in spite of those physical limitations, they could see his glory, the glory of God in Jesus. Now, I want you to notice something really important that may not have jumped out at you. John wrote his gospel at a time when people who were alive during Jesus' lifetime would have read his gospel and could have kind of compared notes. Now, if someone today told you that I was God in the flesh, you know, they said when you look at Andy's deeds, Andy's life, Andy's tone of voice, Andy's intelligence, he's the sum total of all knowledge, he is God in the flesh, you would rightly say that guy's an idiot. Like he has no idea what he's talking about. He's not at all the God in the flesh. But they said that about Jesus in a time when they were trying to convince people to follow Jesus. And people said, you know what, I think that makes sense. That adds up. Looking at his life, that makes sense that he might be the sum total of all knowledge. Looking at his life, he might be God right there in the flesh. I can see the glory of God in him. You see, if Jesus was God, if he represented the sum total of all knowledge, if he holds all things together, if he was the light of all mankind and carried the glory of God, then what we could see from Jesus looking back is that he's the centerpiece of everything. And his impact would only grow even after he's no longer here. The last several weeks, we've looked at prophecies that they made before Jesus, pointing up to Jesus. We're going to end the series today by looking at Jesus' life from the view of history thousands of years later and the impact that this one life made. Because normally when a prominent person dies, when a prominent person steps out of the spotlight, their influence begins to decrease and decrease rapidly. Like I was talking to a teenager a while back, and we were talking about Michael Jordan. They mentioned Michael Jordan. And after several really confusing moments in our conversation, I realized I was talking about this guy, but he was talking about that guy. And we were having this very confusing conversation. Because Michael Jordan to me is the guy on that side, and that's not who Michael Jordan is to that guy. He doesn't even know who that is. Timing matters. Influence wanes over time really quickly. Like over the last 25 years, our world has lost legends across so many categories. The music world lost Johnny Cash in 2003. The entertainment world lost Bob Hope that same year WellSpring started. In 2011, the tech world lost Steve Jobs. So today we have no cash, no hope, no jobs. I wanted to ask you to join me in praying for Kevin, because if Kevin goes, it's all over if Kevin goes. Normally when a prominent person dies, their influence goes away really quickly. And yet Jesus was more prominent a year after he was dead than he was in his lifetime. Jesus was more prominent 100 years after he was dead than he was that first year, and he's more prominent today than ever before. Today, billions of people literally view Jesus as divine, and even other world religions all point to Jesus as a significant religious figure. There's no one like him. It must have been great to hear him teach, to see his miracles, to watch his facial expressions. I would have loved that. But I think in some ways we have a benefit that they didn't have. We have the 2020 benefit of hindsight that looks at a world that's completely changed because of this man. And it requires us to say, who is that guy who's literally changed everything? Because if God came to earth in the person of Jesus and then rose from the dead on the third day, you would see an indelible mark in history, not just at that moment, but like a big stone in the water, you'd see the ripples going out across time, and that's precisely what you see. You would expect the evidence to be obvious, and it is. If Jesus rose from the dead, then he's God, and that has implications for every single one of our lives. Now, if he's just rotting in the ground, then he's a fraud, and we shouldn't waste any more time before New Year's. This should be the last time we come to a church because we're wasting our time. But he's not. There are many strands of evidence. You can see lots of strands. I've been studying this for a number of years now. There's so many strands of evidence that point to Jesus' life and his divinity. I think one of the most interesting to me is his impact on history. So today I want to tease that out a minute and closely examine the evidence of how he's changed everything. And then once we do that, I think that has implications for what 2025 looks like. If you ask a fish about water, assuming the fish, of course, could have a conversation with you. If you ask a fish about water, they're going to look at you confused and ask you, what in the world's water? Because the fish doesn't know what water is. The fish is in the water all the time. And then when you describe water to them, they might say, I'm not sure I believe that. I'm going to need some evidence for this water thing you're talking about. But in reality, they're completely surrounded by it every moment of their life in ways that they don't even fully understand. If you ask a modern person about Jesus, they may or may not believe in him. They may or may not want more evidence. But the reality is they're surrounded by his influence, and it's right there to be seen, hidden in plain sight. So I want to cover five different areas that we see that in. First of all, let's consider geography. Our geography has been shaped by Jesus more than any other figure, living or dead. And it's so commonplace, we don't even see it. We're blinded to it. It's like the fish in the water. I mean, today it's not uncommon to drive down Martin Luther King Boulevard or to see Ronald Reagan International Airport or something like that. But figures from recent history or ancient history pale in their comparison to this man's influence. I mean, every time you see a city that starts with ST or saint, that's referring to a man who's devoted his life to the teachings and ways of Jesus, and that's why they're famous. They're all devoted to Jesus. It all points back to Jesus. So like St. Louis was named after Louis IX of France. He was the only French king that the Catholic Church made a saint, and this large Catholic population in St. Louis said, we want to honor not just Louis, but we want to honor Jesus, who he devoted his life to. It's true every time you see saint. It also is true when you see the word sand. like San Francisco, San Jose, San Antonio, San Diego. All of them point back to a saint, Saint Diego, whatever. They all point back to them who have their roots in the life of Jesus. They're all telling you about Jesus. Santa is the female version of San. So every time you see a Santa, like Santa Ana, Santa Barbara, Santa Clara, Santa Monica, all of them point back to Jesus. You can't look at a map and not see the life of this one sort of remote in his day Jewish carpenter. And why in the world is that true? Now, Santa Fe is a little different. Santa Fe is a phrase that literally means holy faith. It's a Latin phrase. Unless you're in Tennessee. Santa Fe means holy faith. Santa Fe just means redneck. It's a different thing. It's a different Latin phrase. A secondary meaning for Santa Fe is actually farmers selling land to music executives, but it's a subtle distinction. The reality is you can't look at a map without seeing Jesus. But it's like a fish in water. We don't even see it because we're consumed by it all the time. Think about history. In history, in the ancient world, they weren't as optimistic as we are. They didn't assume that things would be better for their kids or grandkids than it is for them. They just kind of tried to get through their time, that life would just go on. And they simply tried to mark time. And they would mark time by the current ruler and how many years into their time it was. That's just the way they saw history. Like Isaiah 6 says, in the year that King Uzziah died. And then Isaiah describes that time. That marks history. Or Luke 2 even, we're talking about Christmas. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So Luke marks time based on Quirinius and Caesar Augustus. But in the 6th century AD, all of that changed. A Scythian monk began to label all the dates with the tag AD, a Latin word Anno Domini. It means in the year of our Lord. And it was designed to mark Jesus' entry, his birth into the world. Now, ironically, the monk got his dates a little off, and Jesus was actually born like at 4 or 5, 6, maybe BC. We're not 100% sure, because they didn't mark time that way in those days. They just marked it based on Augustus or Quirinius. Now they all mark it on Jesus, whether you're a follower or not. I saw a Facebook post a while back, and there was a spat on Facebook. I know that's unusual. You've not seen that before, but it was a spat on Facebook. And they were debating about, a proposal to take Andrew Jackson's face off the $20 bill and put somebody else's face on it. And there's a whole hubbub about that. And so all these people were commenting that I didn't know. And so one lady got on there, and she commented that she was offended because the dollar bill says, "In God we trust." And someone else that I didn't know got on and said that phrase was actually added in the 50s. It wasn't like back, before that. It was added in the 1950s, following World War II, following the Great Depression, which takes on different meaning. It's like these people had just survived the Great Depression, had just survived World War II, and now they're saying we may not be able to count on our military to always protect us. It's a dangerous world. We may not always count on our economy to always provide for us. We're going to put our trust in God alone. That's where the phrase came from. Powerful. But this lady was still offended. That didn't fix it for her, as most Facebook fights, as they go. Still offended. She said people were trying to push religion on her. And I really wanted to get on and put a whole paragraph about the Scythian monk from the 6th century, but I didn't think it would help. Like she's going, "Oh, baptize me. I'm totally convinced now." I didn't think that would really help, so I didn't add that. But the reality is, you can't write a check. You can't open your calendar. You can't pull out the date on your phone without pointing back to this life who changed history. It's all a not so subtle reference to Jesus. Think about medicine. Jesus was a famous healer. John Soper says, "We can find no record in the Gospels of Jesus turning anyone away who came to him for healing, nor do we find that any disease was too difficult for Jesus to heal." And so his followers, trying to emulate his life, said we should take care of people medically. They began to care for the sick almost immediately following Jesus' death. They began to care for the sick. And really early on in church history, next to their cathedrals and things, they would build caring centers for people, clinics and orphanages to take care of the orphans near their monasteries. And today, everything about healthcare around the world is impacted by the life of this not so well known during his lifetime healer. Organizations around the world go by names such as the Red Cross or Salvation Army, Samaritan's Purse, all pointing back to Jesus. Go to any major U.S. city, and what you'll find is most of the hospitals, if not all, point back to Jesus as well. Amy and I used to live in Indianapolis years ago, and her first job was as a nurse for a doctor's office tied to St. Vincent Hospital. Indianapolis is home to St. Vincent, also home to St. Francis, also home to Methodist Hospital. That's all in Indianapolis. Come to Nashville. Vanderbilt Hospital was started by the Methodist Episcopal Church, and for 40 years, the Methodist Episcopal Church ran Vanderbilt Hospital. Baptist Hospital a few years ago was bought by St. Thomas Hospital. Both have their roots in Jesus, all begun by followers of the famous healer. Even the roots of hospitals themselves go back to Jesus. In the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian became gravely ill. And no one could help him. He had all the money, all the power. No one could cure his illness. But there was a guy named Samson, Saint Samson. He was a prominent member in the church. He was a priest, and he was a physician from Constantinople. And Samson had this weird habit. He was so kind, they called him Saint Samson the Hospitable, because he would bring people in to be cared for. And instead of making them go back and forth to their house, he'd say, stay in my house. Especially if they're poor or if they came from a long way, stay here with me and I'll just care for you 24 hours a day. St. Samson took care of Justinian, got him healthy, and in return, Justinian wanted to give Samson all kinds of money. And Samson said, "That's not what I'm in it for." He said, "O emperor, I had silver and gold and other riches, but I left all of that for the sake of Christ, that I might gain heavenly and eternal wealth. Instead," clever Samson, like a good nonprofit director would do, asked for a donation to his ministry. By the way, if you didn't know, today is the last Sunday in the giving year. I'd be remiss as a pastor not to mention today is the last day in the giving year. And in fact, come April, some of you are going to wish you'd listened to me right now and had made a larger donation today. And just know, I told you. So I'm asking you to do it. I'm helping you. Do that for me. That'd be great. So St. Samson said, I'd like some money. I'd like to build a bigger facility. My house is kind of small. That way I can care for more people. And he got all this money together, and they built the largest hospital in the ancient world. Just a few years after that, the plague hit Constantinople, and that facility cared for thousands of people. You know, we don't really know where hospital, the phrase came from, but a lot of people look back to that day and say it was because of St. Samson the Hospitable that we have hospitals today. Mark Nelson says, if you ask what Jesus' influence is on medicine, compassion, I would suggest that wherever you have an institution of self-giving for the lowly, schools, hospitals, hospices, orphanages for those who will never be able to repay, this probably has its roots in the movement of Jesus. It's like a fish in water. We're so surrounded we can't even see it anymore. Even education. And you might not guess this, because education in our day has become very secular, but all of it started back to Jesus. In the ancient world, education was different. Before Jesus and his influence, education was just for the wealthy and the privileged, and almost exclusively for boys. Girls weren't considered worthy of education. But Jesus was a rabbi. Jesus was a teacher. And so he was constantly teaching everyone, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, slave and free. And Jesus made some remarkable statements about teaching. His last command was to go into all the world and to teach. Jesus said that the prime command in life is to love the Lord our God with all of our mind. And so after his death, his followers naturally thought, we've got to teach people. And not just teaching wealthy boys, but boys and girls, rich and poor, slave and free, just like their rabbi had showed them. And so starting about 100 years after his death, Jesus' followers created the first public education in history as in a way to honor their fallen rabbi. And then years later, the Reformation hit, where there was an emphasis of putting the language of God, the Bibles, into everybody's language. And then the printing press was created so everybody could have a copy. And followers of Jesus had a newfound passion to create a literacy movement that has literally changed the course of education in our world. You see Jesus' influence all over it. You even see Jesus' influence in our country as it comes to education. Anybody know which state had the first state-run public education in America? Anybody know? You'll win a trivia contest later. It's Massachusetts. And they created this new system, public education, in 1647 with an ordinance called the Old Deluder Satan Law. I'm not making that up. You can Google it. The first line says, it being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of scriptures. Now let me say this carefully. The state of Massachusetts began teaching its public children because the state legislator said if we don't teach them, that old deluder Satan will keep them from knowing about God. Massachusetts was a little more religious in the 1640s than it is today. You see it in colleges too. Of colleges and universities that began before the Civil War, 92% were begun as religious institutions, often primarily to teach clergy. That was often the primary motivation. The first college in America was begun by the Puritans 6 years after they landed in 1636, and the handbook starts by saying, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Anybody know the name of that first Puritan college? Harvard. Somebody in the back. Puritan minister John Harvard began that school to teach clergy in this new land. You can't look at education, healthcare, geography. You can't even look at time without seeing the fingerprints forever of Jesus. Yale historian Yaroslav Pelikan says, regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about Jesus, he has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. Let's talk about just life for a minute. So a little over 20 years ago, Amy and I moved to Spring Hill, 21 years ago, from a small town in southern Indiana. And we lived on the end of a little cul-de-sac. We had two little girls, 4 and 2 when we moved here. And so we lived on the end of this little cul-de-sac. So we would drive in, and our house was real small and cute, and every house was just kind of starter homes. It's a whole community so a lot of little kids and all of that. And so one day, there's a house like 2 doors down from us that had 2 little boys, like 4 and 6, and they looked like a combination between Calvin and Bart Simpson. Like they had a whole thing going on, and their personalities kind of matched that whole deal as well. They were rough little boys and didn't have a lot of instruction from their parents. And so one day I was driving out and I was late for a meeting, so I was kind of in a hurry. And I always tried to wave at this little boy, trying to kind of warm up to him a little bit because I didn't think he had a lot of influence from adults that was positive. So I was driving out, and he was standing out by the road. So I waved at him real big as I was driving by. And he throws his little pudgy middle finger up and flips me off all the way past my car. I thought, I'm going to break his finger off. That's what I'm going to do in the name of Jesus. No, I didn't do it. So I slammed on my brakes, and he took off running into the house, and I didn't have time to deal with it. I was late for a meeting, so I took off. And I thought, you know how you do. I'll come back tonight and tell his dad. I'd want to know if one of my little girls flipped off somebody. I'd want to know that. I'll come tell him. It'll be fine. Well, then that night turned into next day, turned into 3 days, turned into a week. And I thought, this is silly now. I can't go talk to him about something that happened 8 days ago. Let it go. So about 2 weeks later, I'm driving out again, and this time I wasn't in a hurry. And as I go out, that little boy's out there again, and so I wave as I'm passing, and once again, flips his finger up and put it all the way across, flipping me off as I drive out of the neighborhood. So I slam on my brakes, he takes off, and I thought, I got time, that little sucker. He's in trouble now. So I throw it in reverse, and I back up to his house, and I go knock on his door, and his dad comes to the door, and you could smell lots of alcohol immediately. It's like 10 in the morning, right? And so his dad comes out, and I say, hey, listen, I'm not upset. I'm not offended. I'm a dad. If my daughters had done this, I'd want you to tell me. So I'm just letting you know. And I told him what happened. And he said, hey, little boy's peeking around the corner. So he comes out. And I thought the dad was going to handle this, like be a dad. And so he gets down, sits down, and the dad looks and turns to me like, are you going to handle this? I'm thinking, oh, good, I'll handle this. So I said, hey, buddy, we're not going to do that again, okay? We're just not going to do that again. So I'm going to respect you. You're going to respect me. We're just going to start fresh today. Is that a deal, you think? And he said, yeah, and we shook hands and did a whole thing. And then he took off running. And his dad, I was getting ready to leave, and his dad said, hey, next time, just get out and yell at him. That's what I'd do. I thought, I'll keep that in mind. That's a good idea there. I'll keep that in mind. And from that moment on, until we moved just a few months later, from that moment on, every time I drove out, that little boy would just wave at me on the way out. Kind of makes me sad, honestly. Now, I've not seen that little boy in like 20 years. He's about my daughter's ages. So I can't say for certain what his life has amounted to. And I don't mean to be ugly, but objectively, like if Vegas was voting on this, what do you think his life's turned out to be? I mean, with checked out parents and so little regard for people at age 4, do you think he did well in school? Like, I'm just trying to, like, odds, right? Without outside influence, is he going to grow up to be an upstanding citizen, get a good job, buy a house with a picket fence, marry his high school sweetheart, and raise 2.7 well-adjusted kids who don't flip off the neighborhood pastor on their way out for work? Probably not. He's probably not going to do that. I mean, without outside influence to change the trajectory of his kind of tragic start, it's probably not going to get good. It's more than likely that his disrespect for people will simply grow. At 4, he's raising his finger. At 14, he raises a hand. By 24, he's probably raised a weapon or two. And Vegas would say he's probably going to struggle more than others with addiction and abuse. He might spend some time in jail, certainly more likely to spend some time in jail. Probably won't do well in relationships. And very likely, he'll become the checked out dad who tells the neighbor to yell at his kids because he doesn't want to deal with it. And all of that's true unless this young man wins the lottery and has a teacher or a coach or a long-term neighbor who pours their life into him because they see something in him besides this rough little exterior. And if he does get that winning lottery ticket, I can say with a lot of optimism that will be a follower of Jesus who cares so much about the rabbi who welcomed the little kids that he welcomed him into his life. And as a Christian, this all has much bigger implications than jails and taxes. I mean, what are his chances to get to the end of his life and hear the master say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with what I gave you, and now enter your reward." So let's just be real practical for a minute, because I don't know this boy. He may have turned out great. Let's just be real practical for a minute. What can be inserted into this young man's life to change the trajectory enough that he gets into a different place than his family was? Maybe a new reading program at school, better math and science curriculum, more policemen, tougher jails, maybe just more jails, tough new laws. Is any of that going to really change the trajectory of this guy's life? I would suggest to you that the only hope that the world has to change this young man's life is Jesus. That's it. And I would suggest to you that the only thing the world has found to change an old guy like me's heart is Jesus too. I hear sometimes people talk about being on the wrong side of history. They'll be talking about this political issue or that political issue, and they're like, you're going to look back and realize you're on the wrong side of history. Can I just say to you, if Jesus is not the centerpiece of your life, you're on the wrong side of history? I mean, right now, we're in a moment where in this country, we're becoming more secular and less religious. But that's not true around the world, and it's not been true throughout history. We're the anomaly. The predominant amount of history across the world, including in this country, has been devoted to the ministry of Jesus. Sometimes I hear people say, I wish I had more evidence about what Jesus said or did. If you were an alien and came to this earth, the first question you would ask after observing things is, who's this Jesus guy that's changed the world? So I want to challenge you to be bold. We're starting into a new year. You're going to have New Year's resolutions to think and ignore and not follow through with and all those kind of things. You're going to try to reset some habits. I want to ask you to be bold. Make 2025 a year that you change a neighbor like my young neighbor who needs someone to influence them towards a better direction. Or maybe use your time to influence an older guy like me who's never had someone care about him enough to change the trajectory of his life. You and I have significant reasons to believe that Jesus is the Son of God risen from the dead. And if that's true, then he's the hope of all mankind. He's the hope of the world. He's the hope of your life. He's the hope of my life. So I want you to be bold in your decision to follow him. You can put all your weight on the realities of Jesus and his life. I guarantee you that. So be bold in your following. Be bold in your service. Be bold in your giving. Be bold in your love. Be bold in your kindness. Make 2025 a year that it's obvious that you are devoted, as so many of the people we've discussed, to this man who won't go away because he's God. Why don't you bow your head? Dear Lord, I pray that you would inspire us in very tangible, specific ways to get into the flow of history. That our life would count in this generation and those to come because we devoted our life, as most of history has done, to the life and teaching and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, the centerpiece of all creation and the centerpiece of history. God, if there's anyone here who's become distracted by so many things in life, as I often have been, I pray that today would be a reminder to focus on the narrow way that Jesus provides, not out of guilt or obligation or shame, but out of purpose and direction that matters. And God, I pray that if there's anybody here who's allowed temptations to get a hold of their life, as all of us have, if today's that day for them, that they would submit those before you and in comparison to your lordship would turn from that and turn towards you. And God, I pray if there's anyone here who's just been asking, I wish there was more evidence. I pray that today would either start a conversation or end a conversation that leads to them submitting as I have to your Son Jesus, who has changed everything. And I pray that that would happen or begin today. I pray especially if they got their guard up or their hands stiffed out to you, they would drop those today and really explore your Son and the difference he makes in their life. God, I'm grateful for what you've done. And at the tail end of this season, Christmas and this new year, we celebrate how you're right there, hidden in plain sight. You've changed my life as you've changed this world. And I honor you for that in the name of Jesus.